looking at properties of the IS curve, where we talked about how the IS curve is downward sloping. Then we looked at what factors cause shifts in the IS curve. Now we want to look at what factors determine the magnitude of the slope of the IS curve. That is, what factors determine whether the IS curve is steep, as like here, or whether the IS curve is flat, like here. First, let's see what we mean when we say the IS curve is steep versus the IS curve is flat. So if you want to understand what do we mean when we say the IS curve is steep, what do we mean when we say the IS curve is flat, this can be best understood by considering how the IS curve is derived. Recall that we derive the IS curve by changing the interest rate and seeing what happens to output to maintain goods market equilibrium. We did that earlier, somewhere over here, where to derive the IS curve, we change interest rate and see what happens to output to maintain equilibrium in the goods market. If we go back, this. Yeah, so here. See over here, to derive the IS curve, we said we'll change I and see what needs to happen to Y to keep goods market in equilibrium. We change interest rate, that changed investment, that caused a shift in your demand schedule, that changed output. So that's how we derive it. So if you want to understand what do we mean when we say the IS curve is steep versus the IS curve is flat, for this, let's just go back to how we derive the IS curve. Recall that we derive the IS curve by changing interest rate and seeing what happens to output to maintain goods market equilibrium. Now, as slope increases in absolute value, we get a steeper IS curve like here. Now, let's understand what the steeper IS curve means. Before that, just keep in mind that when we're looking at a downward sloping curve, like the IS curve, for which the slope is going to be negative, when you want to look at how steep or how flat the curve is, a downward sloping curve, we look at the absolute value of the slope. So when you're looking at a downward sloping curve and you want to talk about how steep or flat it is, you are just focusing on the absolute value or magnitude of the slope. Because remember, when you look at slope, we look at two things. One is the sign, that is it plus or minus. This only tells us whether it's positively sloping or negatively sloping. Minus tells us it's downward sloping, like for IS curve. The second thing that we look at the slope is the magnitude or absolute value of the slope. This tells us whether it's steep or flat. The larger the absolute value, the more steeper it is. For example, if we had two IS curves, one had a slope of -2, one had a slope of -5. The minus sign is only there to tell us it's downward sloping, but the magnitude of slope will tell us which is steeper or flatter. So both are downward sloping, but the steeper one is going to be the one with the slope -5, because the absolute value of -5 is 5, the absolute value -2 is 2, and 5 is greater than 2, right? So over here, if we were looking at this, then this would, if these slopes corresponded to these two IS curves, then the M2 is -5 would be this one, and M1 is -2 would be this one. So just remember, whenever you're looking at a downward sloping curve like the IS curve, when you are looking at how steep or flat it is, you're focusing on the absolute value of the slope, ignoring the minus sign. The minus sign is there to just tell us it's downward sloping. When you want to talk about which one is flatter, which one is steeper, we just compare the magnitude or absolute value of the slope. So as slope increases in absolute value, we get a steeper IS curve. Now, what does a steeper IS curve mean? It means that a given change in interest rate, from here we can see the changes from R1 to R2, it's the same change for both the flat one and the steep one. So given change in interest rate produces a small change in output to maintain goods market equilibrium. As we can see for the steeper IS curve, the given change in interest rate R1 to R2 is going to produce a smaller change in output to maintain goods market equilibrium. We know when we drive the IS curve, whenever interest rate changes, output changes to maintain goods market equilibrium. When the IS curve is steeper, you will require a smaller change in output to maintain goods market equilibrium for a given change in interest rate, as we can see here. In both cases, the change in interest rate is the same for R1 to R2. But the change in output in this case for the flatter IS curve is greater than the one for the steeper IS curve. So in considering the steepness of the IS schedule, we're essentially asking how much Y changes for a given change in R to maintain goods market equilibrium. If you require a very large change in Y for a given change in R, so we get a flatter IS curve. So flatter IS curve essentially just means that a given change in R produces a large change in output to maintain goods market equilibrium. That's the economic meaning behind when we say the IS curve is flat.